This chart is from 2005. It clearly shows the massive disparity between the military spending for the United States versus the rest of the world. In fact, the U.S. spends more today on its military than practically every other developed nation on the planet combined. All right? And that trend is increasing exponentially, with $711 billion going to the military in 2008 versus $420 billion seen here in 2005. Now, that leads us to stage number 6, which is when the wealth transfer caused by the expansion of the currency supply is starting to be felt by the population as severe consumer price inflation. And this triggers a loss in the faith of the currency, leading us to stage number 7, which is an en masse movement out of the currency into precious metals and other tangible assets. The currency collapses and massive wealth is transferred to those who had enough foresight to position their money into the right asset class beforehand. Now, I'm going to demonstrate this later in the presentation, but the United States right now is sitting right between stage 6 and stage 7. The United States government actually decided that we were going to share this fate and go through this process just as Rome did back in the year 1914. And I want to share this with everyone in case you're not familiar with it, because it's utterly important that you understand this little piece of history about the United States if you're a citizen here. That year marks the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. Now, some of you may know this, but most of you will not. But the Federal Reserve is not a government-owned institution. In fact, the Fed is a private bank that has private shareholders, and it pays its group of people an annual dividend of about 6%. So it's completely separate from the government. It is accountable to no one. It has never been audited, and yet it has the power to dictate our nation's financial policy and print our currency. So in effect, it controls the money supply of the U.S. and therefore the entire world, because the U.S. is the world's reserve currency. Now, the idea for this private bank was created back in 1910 when a Senator Nelson Aldrich decided to take some time off and invite a few of his hunting buddies to go shoot some ducks, quote unquote, with him on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Now, these friends included investor Paul Warburg, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Abraham Andrew, President of the Rockefeller-led National City Bank of New York, Frank Vanderlip, Henry Davison and Benjamin Strong of J.P. Morgan, and several others. And over the next 9 days, these men created the blueprint for the Federal Reserve and brought it to life. And ever since that moment, the United States of America has not been by the people or for the people, and the concepts of freedom and democracy became nothing more than an illusion here. Well, why is that? Because for the past 96 years, every single dollar in our economy has come from this private bank with private investors, and who profit from the interest the U.S. Treasury must pay them on every single dollar the Federal Reserve creates out of thin air and then loans to the government. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute, because there's probably only a few thousand Americans who really understand what that means. And in my personal opinion, it means that the country known as the United States of America is actually privately owned. Every single house, building, car, and bank in this country is owned by a small group of people who own the Federal Reserve Bank. Cash, which is formally called Federal Reserve notes, isn't money owned or printed by the U.S. government. It's printed by this private bank. And you can see right there in the title of this $50 bill, Federal Reserve note. So we're not carrying around our own national currency printed by our democratically elected government here. We are essentially carrying around these other people's money. And the real irony is that we can never escape this cycle, because we borrow every single dollar in the world into existence, which we now owe the Federal Reserve Bank interest on. The U.S. government can't print its own money, so the only way we can make the interest payments on those Federal Reserve notes is to borrow more Federal Reserve notes, which then accumulates more interest. And that is why every major country in the world runs at a constant deficit. It is literally the largest Ponzi scheme ever created, and there is no way out of it except the fate of Rome or complete default, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And as bad as this sounds, we weren't really completely doomed just yet, because we had the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which at that time required that 40% of all the currency they created be backed by gold. No, unfortunately, our fate was actually sealed on August 15th, 1971, when President Nixon changed the rules of money. Without the approval of Congress, he severed the U.S. dollar's relationship with gold by axing the Bretton Woods Agreement. And he made this unilateral decision during a quietly held two-day meeting on Minot Island in Maine without consulting this U.S. State Department or the International Monetary System. And with the death of Bretton Woods, every currency on the planet became fiat overnight. Now, when a currency is fiat, it simply means that it has no intrinsic value, only the pretend value that a government has decreed it to have. So, as with all fiat currencies, the dollar was now freed from any kind of tangible value, which removed any last form of constraint. And essentially, the Federal Reserve now had the ultimate Amex black card with the ability to create infinite debt, no spending limit, placing the obligation to pay all of it back on the citizens of the world. Now, let's move forward to what's happening today. On the surface, most people think that the severe recession we're in right now is as a result of the busted housing bubble, which resulted in a massive credit contraction. And while that is indeed the case, a lot of people don't realize is that the credit crunch is only 1 in 5 challenges that we're about to face, and in fact, the other 5 are much larger. And this chart is essentially showing here the amount of consumer credit outstanding, and we can see what happened here right in 2007, 2008, when it came to available credit. And obviously this goes all the way back to 1940. It's essentially unprecedented. And that's a theme that I want you all to pay attention to tonight, is the word unprecedented, because we're going to be hearing that a lot. So let's move forward on to the very first challenge of the 5 that we're going to cover tonight. And the first is the housing bubble. And this is what most people are aware of. Back on August 6, 2007, the American Home Mortgage Company filed for bankruptcy. It was the sign that the global currency system could not absorb any more debt. Record amounts of new debt around the world had fueled incredible growth seen in the US, in Dubai, in Singapore, in Malaysia. This is an image of Dubai here. And this massive, amazing city springing forth from barren desert sands in just the span of a decade. All of these nations experienced massive booms in real estate and development. Well, that day, the bubble burst. And because all of this debt had been collateralized and resold time and time again through derivatives, it was an event that was felt around the world. Now, the popping of any credit bubble is actually a deflationary event. And in the case of the Great Depression, it was extremely deflationary. So when a home goes into foreclosure and a loan gets defaulted on, or someone files for bankruptcy, that currency simply disappears into currency heaven, if you will. So as credit goes bad, the currency supply contracts and deflation sets in. And this is exactly what happened from 1930 to 1933. So as wave of foreclosures and bankruptcies swept the nation, 1/3 of the currency supply of the United States evaporated into thin air. And over the next 3 years, wages and prices fell by 1/3. Companies could not afford to pay their employees, and those people could not afford to pay their bills. And as we all know, whether it's from stories from our grandparents or pictures from the history books, it was a very disastrous period in our country's history. Well, this process began once again in 2008 with the popping of the housing credit bubble. Over the past 24 months, deflation has sucked an estimated $60 trillion worth of credit out of the global economy. And that's $60 trillion worth of fuel that was flaming the fires of growth around the world, and it virtually disappeared overnight. The result is massive deflation. Money and credit have become harder and harder to find as the money supply continues to contract. There's less money to be spent, so prices and volume of sales continue to fall. And falling prices and sales volume lead to more layoffs and reduced salaries, which means even less money is spent, creating an even greater downward spiral. Well, today, real unemployment in the United States is actually twice the official number stated by the government, which doesn't include people in that statistic that they give you on the news for people who haven't looked for a job in more than 30 days or those who have just part-time jobs. So if you include those two groups, real unemployment sits right around 23% today, while the unemployment rate during the Great Depression was 24%. So here's a current chart going back to the 1940s showing the number of Americans unemployed for 27 weeks or more to put the severity of the real number into perspective that we're dealing with today. Now here's a second chart from John Williams over at shadowstats.com, who's a lifelong economist who actually continues to still measure the yardsticks of the U.S. economy based on the government's old forms of measurement versus the new ones, because the old ones were much more truthful and much more accurate versus today's. And going by his number right here, we can see that U.S. unemployment is right around 23% as of the end of 2010 versus the official quote-unquote government number that is read to us on the mainstream media on a nightly basis, which is right around 9%. So there you have it. This is actually the real number, and you're just not getting it today. But let's keep moving on. As deflation continues, the value of people's homes continue to decline, and that's destroying the number one source of available equity and credit that most people have amassed. So this is an image of tax revenues for the government on a state level, and we can see the trend here starting in 1980 and the massive drop off of cliff that we've experienced here since 2008. That's the falling tax revenue because incomes are falling. Okay, so this is all tied together and all of the charts are all pointing in the same direction, and it's very easy to start putting together the pieces of the puzzle today, and that's what I want you to pay attention to. Now, these are the issues that the majority of the people in our country are aware of: the housing bubble, the credit bubble, unemployment, because they do hear about it in one way or another on the news, even if it's not the most accurate picture, and they've seen the price of their home decline, or they've potentially been fired. You may have lost your job recently. But let's get into the other problems that aren't discussed nearly as often. The second is record amounts of new debt. You know, Ben Bernanke and the government, because he's a quote-unquote student of the Great Depression, will do everything within their power to fight deflation, because deflation would cause a domino effect of defaulting IOUs that would absolutely destroy a debt-based economy like the one that we have. Too much debt got us into this mess, but we can't let that balloon continue to deflate or it will shrink down to nothing and we will fall into a new Great Depression. So the Fed's only option is to keep pumping in more and more debt in order to stop those IOU dominoes from falling. And with every dollar printed into existence, it decreases the value of the dollars already in the world. Now, this process is called inflation, and all I need to do is show you one simple picture right here. And this chart shows the total amount of currency that's been produced by the Federal Reserve since 1913. It took 84 years from 1913 to 2007 to put $825 billion into circulation. The Fed doubled that number within the first 24 months of this crisis, trying to keep the global bubble inflated, and the politicians are more than happy to encourage this action because they only care about keeping the people happy while their party is in power, no matter what the long-term effects may be. Well, what's the result? All countries will be forced to print money, because if they don't, their currencies are going to rise in value against the dollar, and their exports are going to drop, causing deflation in their economy. And as we've been expecting, this process has started to cause a currency war between nations, and these are just a few of the headlines that I've pulled from the news recently. Many countries have been forced to inflate their currencies before, but never in history has every major country in the world been forced to crank up the printing presses simultaneously. So nations that hold massive amounts of our debt, like China, continue to watch the value of their investment decline with every new stimulus package that is passed. And there's going to come a point in time when all of these countries are going to sell what they have in order to salvage any value the US dollar might have left. Now, while China isn't selling just yet, over the last few months they have all but completely stopped buying our debt. And this is most likely going to result in hyperinflation as the economies of the world race to keep their currencies from appreciating in value against everybody else's. And according to history, the prices of food, energy, and goods are going to skyrocket, bankrupting everybody that you know. Your expenses are going to go up while your income goes down. So anyone that's on a fixed income who doesn't own gold or other commodities is going to be forced